Hi, welcome to the fourth clip of this week's lecture on colonialism. And in this clip, I want very briefly, I'll try to keep it briefer than the previous clip because I think it's a bit unfair on you to expect you to sit there and watch all of this stuff. And we still have a kind of half-an-hour clip coming up with a really interesting interview. I hope you'll find it interesting with Ash, as I said before. So I'll try and keep this one a little bit briefer. In which I'm going to be looking at really this thought, the second and the third points that I made a couple of clips ago about anthropology as a discipline participating in the dynamics of colonialism, and possibly even the third point being itself a form of colonialism, which is, obviously a very powerful, unsettling, and challenging kind of critical thought. So very, very briefly, as I say, let me just take you through certain kind of fundamental insights. There's this incredibly kind of landmark, I mentioned in last week's lecture, the kind of landmark book, Writing Culture from 1986. That was a landmark of the kind of crisis of representation. A decade before that, more than a decade before that, Talal Asad edited this volume that I've got on the left hand of the slide, Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter, in which a whole array of primarily British social anthropologists, awakened by the kind of post-colonial dynamics and structures in the countries in which they themselves were often working, jolted into really grappling head-on with the imbrication and involvement of anthropology as an activity in the structures of colonialism, right? So already in the 1960s, critical anti-colonial movements had targeted or put anthropologists, included anthropologists in among the powers that they were struggling against, because precisely it was felt and understood that anthropologists went part and parcel with colonial domination. So if you look at the map, the countries in which all of the famous monographs of British social anthropology were written were countries that were colonized by the British. The famous monographs of French ethnology and ethnography tend to come from Francophone countries which were colonized by the French. The Americans, think back to Franz Boas, for example, and his students, so much of their anthropological work was based on studies conducted with Native Americans, or indeed Native Americans of the southern hemisphere, southern continent of America, in Latin America, right, etc. So the kind of mapping literally on of anthropology and colonialism was patently obvious, and by the 1960s and 70s it was often said that anthropology was, to use or to coin, as they say, the phrase that was used at the time, a handmaiden of colonialism. So in this volume edited by Assad, this series of essays looks at this claim and actually makes it much more complex than just simply that statement, right? So what becomes more and more apparent is that the stances of anthropologists were actually very varied. Often anthropologists were working in cahoots with colonial administration and taking advantage of the opportunities that colonialism afforded them. But also very often their agendas did not coincide with those of the colonial administrators. And in some cases, anthropologists entered into kind of critical dialogues and had a critical influence on policies of colonial administration. In many cases, anthropologists made common cause with anti-colonial movements as well. So the picture is far more complex than just saying that anthropology was the handmaiden of colonialism, without in any way denying that in many ways it was, right? I think it's also important to say here that one of the arguments that is made by Assad and his colleagues, and then later picked up by Stocking, the historian of anthropology, George Stocking's edited volume from the 1990s of Colonial Situations, which is Essays on the Contextualization of Ethnographic Knowledge, interesting subtitle, the volume on the right there. One of the things that comes out of these more historically minded studies of the conduct of anthropology is the very limited influence that anthropologists have on policy making, on politics and so on, right? So it's very easy to kind of exaggerate the influence that anthropologists have had. That's an important point to bear in mind, right? So one of the further kind of issues that is on the table and has become more and more increasingly debated also in the professional bodies of anthropologists in the United States, there's this thing called the AAA, the Association of American Anthropologists. Here in Britain there's something called the Royal Anthropological Institute. I'm not actually a member of that because I don't think that it's comfortable at all to get involved with anything that's got the tag royal when it comes to anthropology, precisely because the British royal family is deeply implicated in the project of colonialism and colonial violence and domination. So I think it's highly problematic and inappropriate for anthropologists to align themselves personally, that's my view, with anything to do with the crown in this country. But there is another association called the Association of Social Anthropologists, of which I am a member. And in these associations, there's also EASA, the European Association of Social Anthropologists. So in these kinds of bodies, there's been often very significant debates, for example, about the involvement of anthropologists and the recruitment, active recruitment of anthropologists by the American military in the context of neo-colonial, as many would see them, wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, for example, in Afghanistan, and historical events of which you're all aware. Anthropologists were recruited to provide input into the way that the military operated in its occupation, for example, of Afghanistan. Deeply perplexing, problematic developments that show the imbrication of anthropology in neo-colonial contexts, as one would argue these are. The involvement of anthropology in policy advice, in the project of development, NGOs, and so on. From many angles, these have also been argued to be neo-colonial structures. These are all disputed claims, these are all contestable claims, but I'm acquainting you with the kinds of debates that have taken place, right? So the imbrication of anthropology as part of the dynamics of colonialism, post-colonialism and neo-colonialism has been on the table for discussion since the 1970s. But then I want to end this clip with a further and even more perhaps thought-provoking, more than thought-provoking perhaps, thought that is at the heart of the readings that you've been reading this week, both by Said and by Trouillot, the Haitian. So Trouillot is Michel Rolph Trouillot, a Haitian anthropologist working in the United States. He died a number of years ago. Edward Said had a complex life history, born in Lebanon, I believe, and Palestinian kind of origin, but educated. I don't actually remember the full trajectory, but I know he passed through Cairo before ending up in the United States and working there. Also Cambridge, I think, here in Britain. Sorry that I'm not more closely acquainted with Edward Said's biography, but anyway, his origin is from the kind of Middle Eastern region, as in Lebanon. Both of those authors argue in the text that you've reading for this week that anthropology is itself not just intertwined with colonialism, but is itself colonial. And I think particularly relevant here is Trouillot's argument about this famous argument about anthropology and the savage slot. So he places the birth of anthropology in a much longer historical trajectory of discourses about the savage other. So, for example, the role that this idea of the noble savage played in the development of European philosophy, the idea of a state of nature that so excited and titillated the readers, a utopian genres of literature, of utopia, of travel writing, that mixed kind of stereotypical accounts of these to them weird and wonderful peoples that they were encountering in different parts of the globe that were becoming more and more apparent through both trade and colonial military domination, right? So these kind of quasi-mythical figures of what people look like in a state of nature beyond or before in this evolutionary model civilization, right? This discourse about the savage, the uncivilized, and the way in which it was constituted in the way, in the development of colonial images of both the other, but also of the self, of the colonial self, of European science, European politics, European technology as indices of civilization that were to be contrasted with this mirror image of the savage, which was so often romanticized as the noble savage. This idea that somehow with civilization we've lost something as well as gaining things, right? In all of these kind of projects of fantasy and of imagination, the savage slot, argues Trouillot, was fundamental, it was constitutive. And anthropology falls into this slot from its very inception and continues to be part of the production of knowledge of another that is always somehow serving as a mirror image for the colonial sources of knowledge to articulate themselves, right? So for both Said and for Trouillot and for many other critics, anthropology needs to be understood as an avatar of colonialism. And I've put here this image with which I'll close this clip, which is the very familiar image that we've used again and again throughout this course. And all I've done really is substitute the version of the image that I've used for the previous clips on reflexivism, and really asking the question of whether the very act of trying to understand people, that, as I said from the very beginning, that word O, sorry, that letter O on tagging the blue circle stands for object, but can also study for other, right? And there's a complex set of thoughts there. But this, in the context of what we're discussing this week, this tendency to constitute your object of study as an other, right, is at the root of a question that I want to leave really this lecture with, because we'll pick it up in next week's lecture as the central topic of our conversation, is the attempt to understand that other, that object of study, also ipso facto, by the very fact, a way of intellectually colonizing them, right? So when I use my categories, my ways of understanding, my protocols, all of which have been developed in the colonial metropolises, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, UCL, LSE, the Columbia University, Chicago University, Berkeley, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, right? Well, these are all metropolises of colonialism, and that's where anthropology developed and was conceived. This is where we are. This is where UCL is, in London, right? We all hopefully know about the imbrication and influence of colonial money, colonial power in the constitution of our own university, University College London, in the early 19th century, and the ways in which it's been involved in these colonial forms of knowledge, including eugenics, the dark chapter in the history of UCL, right? So anthropology comes out of that. Is anthropology also a form of that? When I try to use the categories that I've developed in my debates with other metropolitan intellectuals, right, including philosophers, including possibly even post-structuralists like Foucault. When I use Foucault in order to understand the post-colonial condition of the people that I study, or even not their post-colonial condition, some other aspect of their life, am I not thereby, in some sense, also colonizing them? So is the very attempt to understand, far from neutral, actually itself a political power move? That's a kind of question that ultimately we have to be confronted with if we adopt the kinds of perspectives that we've been discussing in this week's lecture. I'm going to leave that question hanging because I'm going to really address it directly in the final lecture, which is about this prospect of decolonizing anthropological knowledge and anthropological practice, which we will tackle next week. But before that, we have the chat that I've had with Ashraf Hock, which is the next and final clip of this week. I haven't got a clip on criticisms as I have every week, because actually the conversation with Ash is, as you'll find out, in itself very, very critical in many ways. So I think that in a way is sufficient. So I'll see you in the clip with Ash.